You're listening to On Shifting Ground. I'm Ray Suarez. The reclusive Kim Jong Un rarely leaves North Korea, but in his last two foreign trips, he's traveled in an armored train. It's a tradition that goes back to his grandfather, and it's a symbol of Kim's resistance to change. For Kim, a commitment to old ways also seems to mean loyalty to old allies, because the recent bilateral agreement with Russia harkens back to the earliest days of the Cold War. The Soviet Union was the first country to recognize North Korea in 1948, and relations continued even after the dissolution of the Soviet Union. In the last 75 years, North Korea has increased its reputation as the Hermit Kingdom because it's been cut off from virtually the entire world. And as the Kim regime struggles to gain international legitimacy, the country can only turn to a few remaining allies. What does North Korea's connection with Russia mean for its complex relationship with China? And why should Seoul be worried about Kim's support for Putin? Andrei Lankov is a leading authority on what goes on inside the secretive North Korean state. He's even attended Pyongyang's Kim Il-sung University. He's a director at NK News and writes exclusively for the site. He's also a professor at Kookmin University in South Korea. Welcome to On Shifting Ground.
Thank you for inviting me.
Professor, what can these two leaders, who met with much fanfare, offer each other?
Frankly, not much. But they badly wanted to create an impression that they have a lot to offer. It was a very interesting summit because it had a clear militaristic color. The meeting was on a missile base. Once, Kim Jong Un and Vladimir Putin finished their crab meat dumplings lunch. I would like to have a test. Maybe, I believe it was good. He departed for a trip to first factory producing Sukhoi fighter jets, and then to an Air Force base, where the Russian Minister of Defense himself showed him around, boasting about the Russian heavy bombers. And when he was leaving, a local governor gave him a wonderful present, a small memento about these days, few drones, military drones of course, and a wonderful set of individual armor. Well, everybody was hinting that it was about the military cooperation. And it was very strange. You know why? Military cooperation of any kind with North Korea is a violation of the UN Security Council resolutions. Well, I understand many countries, especially Russia and even more North Korea, would not mind to violate such a resolution. But why are they doing so publicly?
Well, Russia is pretty invulnerable at the UN because apart from General Assembly resolutions, nothing can happen in the Security Council that even bothers Russia. It simply vetoes it, no?
Yes and no. But if a permanent member of the Security Council is openly violating resolutions, well, it's probably not good for its future prospects. It will be quite damaging for the Russian standing in the UN, especially because such military cooperation with North Korea could be done in a very quiet way. I don't think that Kim Jong Un, who might be very smart, is an outstanding rocket scientist. Probably it would be better for him to go to Vladivostok to eat delicious crab meat dumplings and send a couple of smart real rocket scientists and a couple of equally smart North Korean Air Force colonels to these bases. Probably it would be even more useful for their cooperation. Why it was done so publicly?
Well, naturally, a lot of attention has been given not only to the meeting, a lot of attention has been given for the last year and a half to Russia and the conditions inside the country, but fewer people may be paying attention to pandemic and post-pandemic North Korea. What's the situation been like in that, in many cases, opaque country.
Yes, it's really opaque. Because when people say it's secretive and everything, it's basically correct, but somewhat exaggerated, because over the last 25 years, people who are studying North Korea got access to a great amount, to a really large amount of material, previously unavailable, but it's not the case anymore. Number of defectors from North Korea during the COVID from North Korea moved from roughly 1,000 to roughly 50 or 60. Interaction is almost impossible. New documents which have been smuggled in large quantities, including classified material, they are not coming anymore. Foreigners have been kicked out of North Korea. Out of 23 embassies which used to be operational in Pyongyang, only 6 of 7 are still open, usually with skeleton crew. So we know very little, especially about the countryside. But what has happened, in a nutshell, around 2019, Kim Jong Un decided to push back highly successful, market-oriented, if you like, pro-capitalist economic reforms he began to implement around 2012. And thanks to these reforms, North Korean economy was growing pretty fast, 5-6% per year, by the way. However, it's all history now, ancient history. Because these reforms were stopped, partially because they relied on interaction with the outside world, a bit like the Chinese model of the 70s or 80s. And such interaction now, because of the sanctions, is a sanctions regime, which was seriously introduced in 2017, 2018. It had been purely symbolic before. Due to this regime, interaction, economic interaction, trade, foreign investment is almost impossible. So the reforms became extremely difficult to continue. And on top of that, due to the conflict with the United States, China made a strategic decision. They decided to basically pay North Korea, if you like, a universal basic income, to provide North Korea with a certain amount of money, essentially unconditionally, because they just need North Korea to be there as a buffer zone, keeping Americans a bit further away, preventing them to build air bases or listening stations on the other side of the border rivers, on the opposite bank of the border rivers. So North Koreans are getting small but sufficient aid from China. Why should they bother? Why should they play these dangerous games, these reforms which give people freedom to make money? And maybe, just maybe, in due time, these people will start asking for other freedoms. So they decided to stop a bit, to roll the reforms back, and to go as far as possible backwards towards the old hyper-Stalinist economy which existed there. They did not go that far. To a very large extent, North Korean economy still has a large private sector. Most of the, say, service industry, retail, restaurant industry, significant part of the light industry are privately owned, de facto privately owned in North Korea. And it has been the case for a couple of decades. But basically, they rolled it back. They tried to restore universal rationing, so every North Korean would get a certain amount of food and consumption goods, essentially free of charge, but according to the government decisions. And they decided to close the country. They used COVID epidemics as a good pretext to expel, say, 90% of these foreigners who were hanging around, diplomats, aid workers, business people who were hanging around asking them proper questions. And sometimes these foreigners saw something they were not supposed to see, and then happily reported it to media, including maybe the National Public Radio. So North Koreans didn't like it, and they decided to reduce dramatically the number of foreigners residing in Korea, especially in the countryside outside Pyongyang. They built fences along the border with China, and the border with China used to be very poorly protected. Now it's protected quite well. So smuggling is difficult. Defection, which used to be easy. You could say 15, 20 years ago, you could just every night, thousands of people, just especially in winter when rivers were frozen, they were just literally walked away to China or back. Because most of them did not really run away from the country. They were a bit illegal migrant workers. They went to China to make money. It's not the case anymore. So country is much more isolated. They have adopted new laws against the spread of their reactionary culture, and everything foreign is reactionary by definition. So in theory, if you say now make copies of, say, a James Bond movie or maybe some comedy even, you can up in prison, and theoretically even death sentence is possible according to the new law. But it's not known whether it has ever been carried through, but in theory it's possible. So they are trying to exterminate foreign contacts, any knowledge about the outside world, because in order to keep countries stable, they should ensure that the average North Korean would know as little as possible about the life in South Korea and overseas, especially in South Korea, because South Korea is so much richer. According to North Korean own official data, the per capita GDP in South Korea is roughly 25 times higher than per capita GDP in the North. The highest difference in per capita GDP between two countries which share a land border worldwide. So the average North Korean should not know it, should not be aware of it. And it's a question of stability. And Kim Jong Un takes it very seriously, far more seriously than his father, by the way.
You know, it's interesting. A lot of the reporting coming out of the Kim-Putin meeting referred to both countries as desperate. But from what you're saying, it doesn't sound like North Korea is desperate. It has what it needs to provide the basics, right?
Basics is provided by China, pretty much unconditionally. It's not enough to grow the economy, but you know what? The North Korean elite, hereditary elite, it's a bit like an old good or bad feudal state. You have the king, you have barons, you have aristocracy, children and grandchildren who, long time ago, almost a century ago by now, used to ride with the founder of the current royal dynasty when he was fighting for power. Now they are controlling the country, few hundred families, and these people, they have enough. By the way, they are not very rich. It's not some kind of Middle Eastern oil sheikhs. It's a comfortable, by American standards, comfortable upper middle class lifestyle. Nothing special. Maybe I think an American lawyer in a small town lives pretty much same lifestyle, not much better. Maybe a bit better than a high-level North Korean official. But it's okay, it's comfortable. And for them, the major worry is to keep system stable, because they know if the system collapses, they will lose everything. Stability is important. Growth, economic growth is desirable. They would not mind to have some economic growth, as long as it does not create problems with political stability. And now stability is essentially paid for by the Chinese. Why should they worry? They don't. They are not desperate. Now Kim Jong Un is working very hard to develop ICBMs capable of hitting the United States. He has a new dream toy, tactical nukes, which can be deployed eventually against the South Koreans, basically neutralizing the massive superiority of the South Korean military in conventional weapons. He wants to have it. He is busily building nuclear-armed submarines, not very good submarines, specialists say, but still it's floating. And sometimes even can go underwater. And it's a question of time. Don't be sarcastic. What I have seen in 40 years of doing North Korea, it's exactly 40 years now. You know what I have seen. Foreign experts, most of them, have consistently underestimated, first, North Korean regime ability to survive. Second, abilities of the North Korean military engineers.
Given everything you just said, Looking at the way what was meant to be Russia's quick takeover in Ukraine has now gone on for a year and a half, and Russia is likely short on artillery shells, has sustained large and unexpected losses. Does that strengthen Kim's hand in the bilateral relations?
Slightly, yes. Because it seems that one of the topics which were discussed was shipment of the North Korean ammunition to Russia. But you know what? I'm a bit skeptical. I'm not saying it's not happening, but I would not overestimate the significance of such shipments. The first reports about such shipments, published by the US government and by some media reports, appeared in September last year, 1 year ago, exactly 1 year ago. Since then, these shells, this North Korean ammunition, the use of the North Korean ammunition has not been reported even once. To be more precise, it was reported once by the wrong side. Ukrainians, it was the Ukrainian troops who were using North Korean shells, which have the same caliber as their artillery systems. And it's not clear how they got it, but clearly they did not take it from the Russian positions. The most common explanation, some of the Ukrainian officers basically cited, but obviously they are under order not to be too talkative, is that some shipment of the North Korean ammunition, not to Russia because it was shipment by sea, a North Korean ship was intercepted in the sea, and all military cargo was confiscated because it's illegal for North Korea to send any kind of weapons, to sell any kind of weapons overseas, and then basically sent to Ukrainians who have cannons and missile system, rocket systems, which are using the same type of ammunition. So it's all. Russians so far not used it, which doesn't say that ammunition shipments do not happen, maybe, but more likely it says that the scale of these shipments is not very big. Let's face it, North Korea is a heavily militarized economy, but it's a tiny economy. Ratio Russian GDP to the North Korean GDP is roughly 50-1. And North Koreans simply, as they are not capable to produce the amount of ammunition which would make a serious difference in the front line. Of course, the Russian military is happy to have more shells, like any fighting military, but I would not count on North Korea's aid being so decisive.
Might Vladimir Putin be inclined to give technical support and aid that at another time he might have refused, let's say before the Ukraine invasion? Advanced technology, aid in North Korea's nuclear program, things that the North Koreans can't do for themselves.
Question is, first of all, how do you know? Because the remarks about nuclear assistance to the nuclear program, I would not believe it. Because recently Russian government has done a lot of strange things, but it's way too much. Why? Because Russia has always been under the Soviet system, under Yeltsin, under Putin, whoever is in charge, has been very careful about not supporting proliferation. And it's not because Russia is a peace-loving country, but because of simple calculations. If Russia really gives this technology to North Korea, my question is, what is Russia going to get in return? Old shells? North Korea doesn't have enough shells to pay for such expensive technology. But if such technology will be under North Korean control, North Koreans will probably resell it very profitably, or use to produce some weapon systems they will sell. We have seen it before. In the 1970s, North Koreans were asking, demanding, begging Russians and Chinese to provide them with ballistic missiles. The answer was a resolute no. So what did they do? The North Korean intelligence made a deal with Egyptian and Syrian governments because these two countries had Russian ballistic missiles. They smuggled missiles from the Middle East, reverse engineered it to the great dismay of Moscow and Beijing, but largely Moscow, and began to sell copies to Iran. So it was quite free to attack Saddam's Iraq. They were fighting back then. So we have such precedents to start with. So North Koreans cannot pay. They are likely to resell it. And on top of that, China is not going to be happy about it because China wants North Korea to be stable but weak. And all this adventurism with missiles and nukes, it's not what China likes. So all these talks and hints, I believe it's a part of diplomatic game. It's done not because Russia is going to do it, but because Russia wants to block shipments of the South Korean weapons, South Korean lethal military aid to Ukraine. And this is unlike tiny North Korean economy. South Korea is a giant economy and, by the way, is the world's seventh largest exporter of arms. Seventh largest.
To sum up, what were we seeing when Kim, like the other Kims, takes a train to Russia? In this case, goes to Vostochny Cosmodrome, gets shown some fancy weapon systems, is treated to a lovely meal by the Russian head of state. What are we looking at, and what was it for?
To send a message to Seoul. Don't help Ukrainians. If you help Ukrainians, we will help North Koreans. Well, if South Korea makes a political decision to assist Ukraine, they have technical capacity to flood Ukraine with high-quality ammunition, both in quality and quantity, far superior to anything North Korea can possibly provide to the Russian troops. And the major task of this diplomacy seemingly is to prevent it from happening, to do a bit of diplomatic blackmail, making sure that South Koreans would refrain from assisting Ukrainian military. Will it work? I don't know. So far, the South Korean government's official position is that they are not going to ship ammunition to Ukraine. And they're not very enthusiastic about it, to be frankly. South Korean public is supportive of the Ukrainian case, but South Korea is not a country which likes to take active stance in the foreign policy. They usually follow the United States, but with little kind of enthusiasm about getting involved in conflicts far away. But if there is some demand from the US, they are willing to take this American request seriously. So, as a kind of a countermeasure, Russians are engaged in this blackmail. Real technological transfer is possible because, as I have, the Russian government recently has done a lot of strange things, but it seems quite irrational, and probably it's not going to happen. There are other dimensions, of course, which were not much discussed, like, say, North Korean labor, North Korean workers being sent to Russia in large numbers in near future, almost definitely going to happen. Or, say, use of the North Korean port facilities. But it's not sexy. It's not attractive for the journalists, so very few people paid attention to these dimensions, which are probably the actual meaningful content of the summit.
Andrei Lankov is a professor at Kookmin University in South Korea, a very close watcher of what happens in North Korea, and writes for NK News. Thanks for joining us on Shifting Ground.
Thank you. Bye.
You've been listening to On Shifting Ground, produced in partnership with KQED, with funding from listeners like you. Today's episode was produced by Adam Ailey and Andrew Stelzer and fact-checked by Sienna Barnes. It was mixed and mastered by Matteo Schimpf. Additional production and engineering were provided by Rob Spate. KQED's Jim Bennett is our technical supervisor. Jared Sport is our executive producer. Philip Yun is CEO of World Affairs. Our music is from Blue Dot Sessions. I'm Ray Suarez. Thanks for listening.